You are hereby ordered to immediately stop producing, selling, or distributing the proprietary sauce recipe owned by Whitaker Flame Foods, LLC. I read that sentence 3 times at my kitchen table before I started laughing. Not because it was funny, because the recipe they claimed I had stolen was mine. Mine for 43 years. Mine before my son Marcus had his first driver's license. Mine before my daughter-in-law Tasha ever stepped into my house wearing that bright smile and asking for extra cornbread. I'm glad you're here. Stay with me until the end, and tell me where you're watching from, because what happened next changed the way I looked at family forever. The envelope had arrived on a Tuesday morning between my electric bill and a coupon flyer from the grocery store. Nothing about it looked unusual except the expensive law firm logo stamped across the top left corner. I had just finished simmering a fresh batch of peach chipotle sauce in my 6-quart Dutch oven. The kitchen smelled like smoked peppers, brown sugar, cider vinegar, and summer peaches. My late husband James used to say he could find our house blindfolded just by following that smell down the street. I remember holding that letter in one hand and my wooden stirring spoon in the other, feeling like the floor beneath my little Ohio kitchen had shifted an inch to the left. According to the document, I was illegally using a protected commercial formula registered under Whitaker Flame Foods, LLC. They demanded I stop immediately. They demanded I surrender any remaining inventory. They threatened legal action if I continued making their sauce. Their sauce. I looked over at the cooling jars lined across my counter. 12 glass mason jars. Hand-labeled. Small batches I sold twice a month at church fundraisers, farmers markets, and holiday bake sales. I wasn't running some national company. I was a 68-year-old widow who still clipped coupons and reused gift bags. But the thing that made my stomach tighten wasn't the legal threat. It was the company name. Whitaker Flame Foods, LLC. Whitaker. My last name. My family name. My son's name. I picked up my phone and called Marcus immediately. He answered on the 4th ring, sounding distracted, like I had interrupted something more important than his mother having a minor emotional collapse in her kitchen. Mom, I'm in the middle of something. My voice stayed calm. Too calm. Marcus, I just got a legal notice saying I can't make my own sauce anymore. Silence. A long silence. Then a slow exhale. You got the letter already? Already. Not what letter? Not are you okay? Already. Something cold moved through my chest. Marcus, I said quietly, what exactly is going on? He lowered his voice. Mom, Tasha trademarked the recipe months ago. You should have called before selling anything. I actually thought I misheard him. Tasha what? Mom, don't make this harder than it has to be. Harder. I stared at the family photo magnet hanging on my refrigerator. Marcus at age 10 holding a fishing pole beside James. Smiling. Missing front teeth. My little boy. That recipe came from your father's handwritten notebook, I said. You know that. Recipes evolve, he answered flatly. Businesses need ownership. Tasha built something real with it. Built something real. My fingers tightened around the phone. Outside my kitchen window, my bird feeder swung gently in the spring breeze like the world had decided to continue normally while mine cracked open. I thought about Thanksgiving last year. Tasha standing beside my stove asking sweet questions about measurements, simmer times, spice ratios. I just love preserving family traditions, she had said. I believed her. God help me, I believed her. Marcus cleared his throat. Mom, just stop selling the sauce for now. Let legal handle it. Legal. That was the moment I understood something painful and simple. They weren't afraid I would fight back. They had already decided I wouldn't. That night, I did not sleep much. Not because of the legal letter. Not even because of Marcus. It was the quiet that got to me. The kind of quiet that settles into a house after someone you love has been gone for years, but somehow still feels newly absent. James had been gone almost 5 years, but there were nights when I still reached across the bed expecting warmth on the other side. I made chamomile tea around midnight and sat at my kitchen table staring at the old recipe notebook locked inside my pie safe cabinet. I had not opened it in months. Maybe longer. James bought that notebook from a hardware store clearance rack in 1981. Plain brown cover. Cheap paper. Nothing special unless you knew what lived inside it. Every experiment. Every holiday adjustment. Every sauce stain. Every tiny note in James's slanted handwriting. More paprika next time. Reduce vinegar by 1 tablespoon. Eleanor was right about the peaches. Our life was inside those pages. Not just a recipe. A marriage. A business dream we never quite chased because life happened. mortgage payments, little league fees, broken water heaters, college tuition, raising Marcus. The next morning, I went through my usual routine because sometimes routine is the only thing keeping grief and anger from swallowing you whole. I fed the birds, watered the herbs on my back porch, drove my old Honda Civic to Miller's Market for groceries. But something fell off the moment I walked in. The cashier, Linda, gave me an odd smile. Not rude, not warm either, just uncomfortable. Halfway down aisle 7, I saw why. There was a display near the specialty foods section. Black shelving, fancy signage, sample crackers stacked in neat rows. And sitting front and center were glass bottles labeled Whitaker Flame Southern Peach Heat Sauce. I stopped walking so abruptly that a shopping cart clipped my heel. My name, my family name, wrapped around my sauce in a font I had never chosen. I picked up a bottle with trembling fingers. Peach Chipotle, 16 ounces, small batch crafted, family heritage flavor. Family heritage. I turned the bottle over slowly. Ingredients listed in almost the exact order James and I used for 40 years. Not identical. Close enough to make my stomach twist. Then I saw the smiling photo on the side panel. Marcus and Tasha. Arms crossed. Proud founders. Proud founders. No Eleanor. No James. No mention of where any of it came from. I stood there longer than I care to admit, holding that bottle like it had personally insulted me. A young employee approached with a sample tray. Would you like to try it? She asked cheerfully. I almost laughed. Honey, I said softly, I know exactly what that tastes like. I bought a bottle. Not because I wanted it. Because I needed proof in my own kitchen under my own light. Back home, I opened it carefully and poured a spoonful into a white ramekin. Same smoky sweetness. Same slow pepper finish. Same tiny hint of cinnamon James insisted nobody would notice, but everybody somehow loved. I leaned back against my counter and closed my eyes. They did not create this. They copied it. My phone buzzed around 3 in the afternoon. Tasha. I stared at her name across the screen before answering. Her voice sounded polished. Controlled. Corporate. Eleanor. I heard you spoke with Marcus. Not Mom. Not Eleanor with warmth. Just Eleanor. I did. I know emotions are high right now. Emotions. Interesting word choice when someone has taken 40 years of your life and packaged it with custom branding. We really want to handle this professionally. Professionally. I looked across my kitchen toward James's notebook still sitting unopened inside the cabinet. Tasha, I said quietly, when exactly were you planning to tell me you built a company around my family recipe? She paused just long enough for me to hear calculation working behind the silence. We modernized it, she said carefully. We transformed it into a scalable product. Scalable product. Not family memory. Not tradition. Not love served beside Sunday roast chicken and summer cookouts. Scalable product. That was when something inside me stopped hurting and started paying attention. I did not answer Tasha right away. At 68, I had learned that silence makes people reveal more than arguments ever do. She filled the space almost immediately. Eleanor, this is not personal. I looked around my kitchen at the faded yellow curtains I had sewn myself 20 years ago, at James's old coffee mug still sitting beside the sink, because I could never quite bring myself to throw it away. Not personal. That was a fascinating thing to say to the woman whose family history you had bottled, branded, and legally fenced off. Not personal, I asked quietly. You used my husband's notes. We used inspiration, she corrected smoothly. There is a difference. Inspiration. Another clean business word wrapped around something messy. I thanked her for calling, told her I needed time to think, and hung up before she could continue polishing the story into something easier to live with. Then I did something I had not done in years. I unlocked the pie safe cabinet and pulled out James's notebook. The cover felt rough beneath my fingertips. Familiar. Honest. The pages opened with that soft, worn sound old paper makes when it has survived decades of kitchens, moves, and ordinary life. There it was. Page 42. Peach Chipotle sauce. James's handwriting slanting slightly downhill across the page. Date written neatly in the corner. August 9th, 1983. Notes in the margins. Adjust cayenne for church crowd. Eleanor says less cinnamon in hot weather. Tiny stains from vinegar splatter and peach syrup. Evidence of real life. Real hands. Real time. I sat there reading page after page longer than I meant to. Our barbecue glaze experiments. Holiday cranberry relish disasters. The year James became obsessed with smoked paprika and put it in practically everything for 6 months. By late afternoon, the anger inside me had shifted shape. It was no longer sharp confusion. It was careful curiosity. Because something did not fit. Tasha was ambitious. Marcus was conflict avoidant. But legal filings, trademarks, product manufacturing, packaging contracts, that was not something people built overnight between family dinners and holiday photos. This had been happening for a while. Quietly. Systematically. And somehow, I had missed it. I drove to my attic storage unit just before sunset. Small place on the edge of town behind a tire shop and a laundromat. James used to joke that we kept half our lives packed inside cardboard boxes labeled important stuff maybe. He was not wrong. I spent nearly 2 hours sorting through bins of tax returns, old business receipts, recipe contest paperwork, church cookbooks, and faded folders held together with brittle rubber bands. Dust clung to my sweater sleeves. My knees complained every time I knelt down. Then, buried inside a file box labeled Farmer's Market Miscellaneous, I found something that made me stop breathing for a second. A contract packet from 1994. James had forgotten to mention this to me. Or maybe I had forgotten. Back then, a regional grocery chain had approached us about carrying our sauce in 3 local stores. Nothing huge. Just a trial program. We turned it down because Marcus had just started college and James's father was sick. Life again. But attached to the proposal was ingredient documentation, product development notes, and signed authorship acknowledgement forms listing James Whitaker and Eleanor Whitaker as original creators. Original creators. My hands rested on that paper for a long moment. Outside, I could hear traffic humming beyond the storage building walls. Not loud, just steady. The sound of the world continuing while pieces quietly fell into place. This was bigger than hurt feelings. Bigger than family drama. Bigger than a misunderstanding over recipes. Someone had built a legal story around the assumption that I either had no records or no fight left in me. My phone buzzed again as I packed the documents back into my tote bag. Marcus. I let it ring once. Twice. 3 times. Then I answered. His voice sounded softer this time. Careful. Mom, can we please handle this like adults? I looked down at the signed paperwork in my hands and felt something almost unfamiliar settle into my chest. Calm. Marcus, I said gently. That depends entirely on whether anybody around here has been acting like one. I almost did not go to Sunday dinner that week. For several minutes, I stood in my bedroom holding 2 sweaters, arguing with myself like a woman deciding whether she still belonged in her own family. But habit is powerful. So is hope, even when you wish it was not. I chose the navy sweater James always liked, packed the document folder into my tote bag without really knowing why, and drove 20 minutes across town to Marcus and Tasha's house. Their place looked exactly like it always did. Fresh mulch around the flower beds. 2 expensive SUVs in the driveway. Warm porch lights glowing against the early evening sky. Everything polished. Everything normal. That was the strange thing about betrayal. It rarely announces itself with thunder. Sometimes it sits behind a cheerful front door holding a charcuterie board and asking if you want sparkling water. Tasha opened the door, smiling too brightly. Eleanor, you made it. Made it. Interesting wording, considering she had recently sent legal paperwork into my kitchen. The house smelled like rosemary chicken and garlic bread. Music played softly through hidden speakers. Marcus kissed my cheek quickly, distracted, restless. I noticed he kept checking his phone every few minutes. Business stress, I would have assumed once. Now I wondered how many conversations were happening without me. Dinner started pleasantly enough. Weather, rising grocery prices, a neighbor's new fence dispute. The ordinary small talk families use when everyone senses a larger conversation lurking nearby, like a storm cloud no one wants to acknowledge. Tasha finally broke first. She set down her wine glass carefully and folded her hands together. Corporate posture. Controlled tone. Eleanor, we thought it would be healthy if we cleared the air. Healthy. Another one of those polished words. That sounds lovely, I said calmly. Marcus shifted in his seat. Mom, nobody wanted this to become ugly. Ugly. I cut a small piece of chicken and chewed slowly before answering. Interesting. Because legal threats usually suggest someone skipped straight past uncomfortable and landed directly in ugly. Silence settled over the table. Not explosive silence. Tight silence. The kind that makes silverware suddenly sound too loud. Tasha inhaled slowly. You have to understand, we invested a lot into building this company. Building this company. I noticed she did not say building our company. Packaging, manufacturing agreements, branding consultants, distribution outreach. We took risks. Risks. There it was again. The language of ownership carefully replacing the language of family. Marcus leaned forward. Mom, you sold a few jars at church events. This is different. A few jars. Funny how people shrink your history when they need your contribution to look insignificant. I rested my fork on my plate and looked at my son. Really looked at him. The lines near his eyes. The tension in his jaw. The boy who used to lick sauce off wooden spoons standing barefoot in my kitchen after Little League practice. Marcus, I asked quietly, when exactly did you decide your father's work no longer belonged to his own family? He flinched. Just slightly. Tasha answered before he could. That is not fair. Is it not? I asked. Because fairness feels worth discussing suddenly. Her expression tightened for the first time all evening. The polished calm slipped an inch. We improved the formula. You added more sugar, I said, and reduced the smoke profile to appeal to wider retail demographics. The silence that followed felt different. Sharper. Marcus stared at me. Tasha blinked once. You tasted it, she said carefully. I bought a bottle, I replied. $16.99, if memory serves. Nobody touched their food after that. I could almost hear invisible calculations moving around the table. What I knew. What I did not know. How much evidence I might have. Marcus rubbed both hands together anxiously. Mom, can we just be practical here? Practical. What would practical look like to you? He glanced at Tasha before answering. That glance told me more than his words ever could. Maybe we work something out. A royalty arrangement. Something respectful. Royalty arrangement. I sat back slowly in my chair. Not apology. Not acknowledgement. Not truth. A payment structure. They were negotiating with me like I was a supplier who had become inconvenient. And somehow, in that exact moment, something became crystal clear. They were not speaking to Eleanor, wife of James Whitaker, keeper of 40 years of family history. They were speaking to the version of me they believed still existed. The soft one. The grateful one. The older woman who would accept a compromise simply to keep peace at the dinner table. I folded my napkin neatly beside my plate and smiled gently enough to make both of them visibly relax. You know what? I said. Maybe you are right. Maybe we should talk practical. I drove home from dinner with the windows cracked open even though the April air still carried a chill. Not because I needed fresh air. Because I needed space to think without the sound of Marcus defending business strategy or Tasha polishing theft into entrepreneurship. The highway lights blurred softly across my windshield as one sentence kept replaying in my mind. A royalty arrangement. My own son had looked me in the eye and offered me a percentage of something that had begun in my kitchen before he knew how to tie his shoes. By the time I pulled into my driveway, I was no longer angry in the way people expect anger to look. No raised voice. No shaking hands. Just clarity. Calm, uncomfortable clarity. I unlocked my front door, kicked off my shoes, and walked straight to the pie-safe cabinet. James's notebook was exactly where I had left it. Honest things usually are. I made myself a cup of decaf coffee even though it was nearly 10 at night. Old habits. Small rituals. Anchors for difficult evenings. Then I spread everything across my kitchen table. The notebook. The 1994 grocery proposal. Ingredient documentation. Old market receipts. Photos from county fairs where our sauce sat beside homemade pies and canned peaches. 40 years of evidence disguised as ordinary life. Somewhere around 11:30, I noticed something I had overlooked before. Tucked into the back pocket of the grocery proposal folder was a business card. Slightly bent. Faded blue lettering. Sandra Pike. Food Product Compliance Consultant. I stared at the card for a long moment. Sandra. Good grief. I had not thought about her in nearly 20 years. She helped James navigate labeling requirements during that old grocery conversation. Sharp woman. Practical. No nonsense. Last I heard, she was consulting for specialty food startups throughout the Midwest. I almost laughed at the timing. The universe does enjoy irony. The next morning, after feeding the birds and pretending to care about my crossword puzzle for exactly 6 distracted minutes, I called the number printed on the card. I expected voicemail. Maybe a disconnected line. Instead, A brisk female voice answered on the third ring. Sandra Pike speaking. Older now. Slightly rougher voice. Same energy. I introduced myself. There was a pause. Then warm recognition. Eleanor Whitaker? Peach Chipotle Eleanor. I smiled despite everything. That would be me. 40 minutes later, we were sitting in a quiet coffee shop halfway between our towns. Sandra wore reading glasses on a chain around her neck and carried 2 legal pads overflowing with handwritten notes. Some people age into gardening or golf. Sandra apparently aged into organized paperwork. I gave her the short version. The product. The legal notice. The family complications I was still struggling to say out loud without sounding ridiculous even to myself. She listened without interrupting, stirring exactly 1 packet of sweetener into her tea. When I finished, she leaned back slowly. Question, she said. Did you ever formally assign ownership rights to anybody? No. Did you sign development agreements? No. Licensing contracts? No. Recipe transfer documentation? Absolutely not. She nodded once. Calm. Clinical. Then somebody is operating on confidence more than clean paperwork. Confidence more than clean paperwork. The phrase landed heavily. Because that sounded exactly like what had happened. Sandra asked to see the documents. I slid the folder across the table. She reviewed everything carefully, stopping twice to adjust her glasses and once to mutter, "Well, now that is interesting." I waited. Patiently. Mostly patiently. Finally, she looked up. Eleanor, I'm going to say something important. Her voice lowered slightly. The food business is full of people who assume older creators did not keep records. Especially family businesses. They count on memory fading faster than paperwork. Something tightened quietly inside my chest. Not from fear this time. Recognition. Because that was exactly what this felt like. An assumption. A calculation. Sandra tapped the old grocery documentation with 1 fingernail. This matters more than you realize. How much more? I asked. She met my eyes directly. Enough that if I were you, I would stop treating this like a painful family misunderstanding and start treating it like a legal timeline. Legal timeline. I wrapped both hands around my coffee cup, suddenly aware that the conversation had shifted into different territory entirely. Then Sandra asked a question I had not considered until that moment. Eleanor, have you actually looked up their company filings? I blinked. No. She pulled out her phone, opened a browser, and turned the screen toward me. Then let us start there. I had expected a small company website and maybe a few retail listings. I had not expected a polished corporate filing trail sitting quietly online like a stranger wearing my family name. Sandra scrolled through the state business records with the calm focus of someone who had spent decades untangling other people's ambitious paperwork. Whitaker Flame Foods, LLC. Active status. Filed 11 months earlier. Registered business address tied to a commercial kitchen facility outside Columbus. Managing members, Marcus Whitaker and Tasha Whitaker. I leaned closer toward the phone screen, feeling something heavy settle in my stomach. 11 months. This had been underway for nearly a year. Family dinners. Birthdays. Thanksgiving. Casual phone calls. Every holiday hug wrapped around a business plan I knew nothing about. Sandra opened another document. Trademark application. Product branding materials. Market expansion language. Investor outreach summary. My eyes stopped on a single sentence buried halfway down the filing notes. Developed from a proprietary family-inspired regional recipe modernized for commercial distribution. Family-inspired. Not family-licensed. Not family partnership. Family-inspired. It was remarkable what people believe they could hide inside carefully selected wording. Sandra glanced at me. You see what they are doing? I nodded slowly, trying not to technically lie. Exactly. She took a sip of tea that had gone cold 20 minutes earlier. This language is defensive. That usually means somebody anticipated questions. Anticipated questions. The phrase stayed with me all afternoon, because questions suddenly multiplied in my mind faster than I could organize them. When had Marcus and Tasha rented a commercial kitchen? Who financed the launch? Who designed the branding? Who filed legal paperwork? More importantly, who advised them to send that cease and desist letter to a 68-year-old widow selling jars at church events? Because that part still bothered me. Not just the arrogance. The strategy. Sandra must have seen something changing in my expression because she lowered her voice slightly. Eleanor, I want to ask you something uncomfortable. Go ahead. Has your son always handled conflict this way? I almost answered immediately. Then I stopped, because the truthful answer required walking backward through years I had not examined closely enough. Marcus had never loved confrontation. Even as a child, he negotiated instead of fought. Smoothed tension. Avoided difficult truths until avoiding them became its own kind of problem. But this required planning. Secrecy. Legal escalation. Layers. No, I said finally. Not like this. Sandra nodded thoughtfully, but did not comment further. Some professionals know when silence does better work than advice. Before we left the coffee shop, she wrote down 2 names on a napkin. One was a business attorney specializing in intellectual property disputes. The other was a food compliance records investigator she trusted. You do not need to hire anybody today, she said. But information is oxygen in situations like this. Information is oxygen. I carried that sentence home with me. The house felt unusually quiet when I walked through my front door that afternoon. Sunlight stretched across my kitchen floor in long golden stripes. James's coffee mug still sat beside the sink. Familiar things. Steady things. I opened my refrigerator absently looking for iced tea and froze halfway through reaching for the pitcher. There, tucked behind leftover potato salad, sat a plastic deli container from Thanksgiving. Handwritten label in black marker. Tasha's test batch. I had completely forgotten about it. Last Thanksgiving, Tasha had shown up carrying experimental sauce samples, laughing, asking everyone for feedback. Just playing around with flavor profiles, she had said brightly. James's notebook had been sitting on my kitchen counter that entire weekend because I had been cooking nonstop for family. A strange cold feeling traveled slowly through me. I set the tea pitcher down untouched and stared at that container longer than I care to admit. Not because it proved anything by itself, because memory suddenly rearranged itself into a different shape. Thanksgiving questions about measurements. Casual curiosity about shelf life. Requests for ingredient substitutions. Compliments designed to keep me talking. I walked to the pie-safe cabinet and opened James's notebook again. This time, I did not just look at recipes. I looked at the page corners, the wear patterns, the tiny fold on page 42. And then I noticed something that made my heartbeat slow down into sharp, careful attention. The notebook had not been where I usually kept it during Thanksgiving. It had been on the kitchen island beside the serving dishes. Unattended. Accessible. My phone buzzed softly on the counter. A text from Marcus. Hope you are taking some time to cool down. We all want a peaceful solution. I read the message twice. Then I placed the phone face down without responding. Because for the first time since this began, a question had surfaced that mattered more than peace. I no longer wondered whether they had used our work. I was beginning to wonder exactly how they got it. I spent most of Thursday doing something I had not done in years. I investigated my own family. Quietly. Methodically. Without announcing it to anyone. There is something deeply unsettling about opening your laptop at 68 years old and searching public records on your son like you were researching a stranger before a business meeting. Yet there I sat at my kitchen table with reading glasses halfway down my nose, legal pads spread around my coffee cup, learning details about Marcus and Tasha's company that they had never once mentioned during birthdays, Sunday dinners, or holiday gatherings. The more I looked, the less accidental any of this seemed. Product launch timelines, vendor partnerships, trade show appearances, promotional interviews. One local food blog even featured a smiling photograph of Marcus and Tasha standing beside stacked sauce displays under a headline celebrating entrepreneurial innovation. I read the article twice. Inspired by family traditions, the couple developed a premium regional flavor profile after years of experimentation. Years of experimentation. Interesting phrasing considering Thanksgiving had not even happened a year earlier. I printed the article. Then another. Then investor materials Sandra helped me locate through archived promotional links. By noon, my kitchen looked less like a widow's home and more like a small investigation office run by somebody who suddenly had too many questions and just enough patience to chase them. Around 1:30 in the afternoon, my doorbell rang unexpectedly. I nearly ignored it. I was not in the mood for neighbors selling fundraiser popcorn or church committee reminders. But when I opened the door, I found Naomi standing on my porch holding an iced coffee carrier and wearing an expression that immediately told me this was not a casual visit. Naomi was my grandniece from James's side of the family. 27 years old. Smart. Sharp-eyed. Works in digital marketing in Cincinnati. She hugged me tightly before stepping inside. "You look tired," she said gently. "You sound like your grandmother," I replied automatically. She handed me an iced coffee. Good. She was usually right. We settled at the kitchen table, and for a few minutes we talked about harmless things. Work deadlines, traffic, the ridiculous price of groceries. But Naomi kept glancing toward the scattered papers across my table. Finally, she lowered her voice. "I heard there is some kind of issue with Marcus and Tasha's company. Small towns, family networks. News travels faster than weather systems." I considered brushing it off. Then I surprised myself by telling her the truth. Not every legal detail. Just enough. The product, the documents, the recipe history. The silence that followed stretched longer than expected. Naomi stared down into her coffee cup. Not shocked, not confused, uneasy. My stomach tightened slightly. "Naomi," I said carefully, "what are you not saying?" She looked up quickly. "I probably should have mentioned something months ago." Months ago. My heartbeat slowed into that peculiar stillness that comes right before unpleasant information arrives. "Mentioned what?" She hesitated. "Last Thanksgiving. I saw Tasha taking pictures." "Pictures of what?" Another pause. "Small. Heavy. Your notebook." The room felt strangely quiet after that. Not dramatic quiet. Detailed quiet. Refrigerator humming. Clock ticking near the stove. Bird feeder tapping softly against the window outside. Ordinary sounds continuing while my understanding shifted another inch sideways. Naomi rushed to explain. I did not think much of it at first. Everybody was cooking. People take food pictures. But she was not photographing the turkey or desserts. She had your notebook open beside the island. My hands rested very still on the edge of the table. "Did she know you saw?" Naomi shook her head. "I do not think so. She closed it fast when somebody walked back in." I stared toward the pie-safe cabinet without really seeing it. Thanksgiving. The unattended notebook. The casual questions. The test batches. Family-inspired. Years of experimentation. Pieces that had floated separately for days suddenly began locking together with uncomfortable precision. Naomi looked miserable. "I am sorry, Aunt Eleanor. I honestly thought maybe she was asking your permission or helping organize recipes, or I do not know." I reached across the table and squeezed her hand gently. "You are not the one who owes me an apology." She nodded silently, but did not look relieved. Before leaving, Naomi paused at the front door. "There is one more thing." I looked up. Tasha mentioned a big investor presentation next week. She sounded nervous. Like everything depends on it. Investor presentation. Next week. After she left, I stood alone in my entryway for a long moment letting that information settle. Outside, the afternoon sun warmed the front porch steps. Inside, my house smelled faintly of peaches, spices, and cooling coffee. I walked back to my kitchen table, looked down at the growing stack of documents, and for the first time since this began, I did not feel confused. I felt prepared. Monday morning arrived with rain tapping softly against my kitchen windows and a strange sense of focus I had not felt in weeks. Not peace, not forgiveness. Focus. The kind that comes when confusion finally gives way to direction. I called the attorney Sandra recommended at 8:15 sharp. His name was Daniel Mercer. Intellectual property law. Specialty food disputes. Calm voice. No unnecessary drama. The kind of person who sounded expensive even when discussing scheduling options. By noon, I was sitting across from him in a quiet office lined with framed certificates and shelves full of legal binders that looked heavy enough to contain entire human mistakes. I brought everything. James's notebook, the 1994 grocery documentation, printed company filings, product photos, investor materials, the cease and desist letter folded neatly inside a manila folder that suddenly felt less intimidating than it had a week earlier. Daniel reviewed the paperwork slowly, asking precise questions without interrupting my timeline. Dates, access points, witnesses, product evolution, family relationships, the practical dismantling of emotional chaos into usable information. At one point, he removed his glasses and looked directly at me. "Mrs. Whitaker, I want to be careful with expectations." Fair enough. I appreciated careful people more than confident ones these days. However, he continued, tapping the old grocery proposal packet. "This documentation matters. A great deal." Something inside my chest loosened slightly. Not victory, just validation. Different thing entirely. He explained ownership history, evidentiary value, authorship records, and the uncomfortable reality that family disputes involving informal creations often became messy precisely because trust replaced contracts for too many years. Trust. There was a word carrying more weight than any legal filing in this story. What happens now? I asked quietly. Daniel leaned back in his chair. Now we gather timelines. We verify filings. And we avoid emotional confrontation until we understand exactly what position they are operating from. Avoid emotional confrontation. That part, surprisingly, felt manageable. I had already spent days swallowing reactions that would have been easier in the short term and disastrous in the long term. Before leaving, Daniel asked one final question. You mentioned an investor presentation next week? I nodded. According to family chatter. He folded his hands thoughtfully. Interesting timing. Why? He gave a small measured smile. Because companies seeking investment usually rely heavily on clean ownership narratives. Clean ownership narratives. Another elegant phrase hiding sharp consequences beneath professional wording. I drove home through steady rain, feeling something unfamiliar settling into place. Not revenge. Preparation. Back at my house, I changed into sweatpants, reheated leftover soup, and organized my dining room table into labeled evidence stacks like a retired librarian preparing for litigation. Around 5 in the evening, my phone buzzed. Tasha. Again. I considered letting it go to voicemail. Instead, I answered. Her voice sounded unusually warm. Too warm. Eleanor, I wanted to check in. Check in. Interesting choice from someone who had checked me directly into legal correspondence. That is thoughtful, I replied evenly. She laughed softly. Polished. Controlled. I know things have been tense, but I really believe we can find common ground. Common ground. I looked across my table at 40 years of documented authorship. What exactly does common ground look like to you? There was a brief pause. Partnership possibilities. Recognition. Compensation structures. Compensation structures. There it was again. Not truth. Not accountability. Packaging. Negotiation language wrapped around family injury. Then she added something that made me pay very close attention. We are close to something big, Eleanor. A lot of people are depending on this launch. Close to something big. Investor presentation. Timing pressure. Dependency. I kept my voice soft. Curious. You sound confident. We have worked very hard for this, she replied carefully. Worked very hard. I believe that part, actually. Ambition requires effort. So does concealment. After we hung up, I stood quietly in my kitchen listening to the rain against the windows. A lot of people are depending on this launch. The sentence lingered in the room long after the call ended. Because for the first time since this began, I realized something important. They were not simply protecting a company. They were protecting momentum, deadlines, investors, expectations, which meant pressure existed somewhere inside their polished operation. Pressure creates mistakes, and mistakes, in my experience, tend to arrive right before the truth becomes expensive to ignore. 3 days before the investor presentation, I received an email that changed the temperature of the entire situation. Not from Marcus, not from Tasha, from their attorney. Polite tone, expensive formatting, careful wording wrapped around quiet urgency. They requested a private meeting to discuss mutually beneficial resolution opportunities. I read the message twice while standing in my kitchen holding a dish towel I had forgotten I was folding. Mutually beneficial. Interesting how quickly language softens when timelines grow tight. Daniel reviewed the email within the hour. They are moving faster now, he observed calmly over the phone. That usually means one of two things. They are confident, or they are nervous. Which do you think? I asked. A brief pause. Let us find out. The meeting was scheduled for Thursday afternoon at a sleek office building downtown. Neutral conference room. Glass walls. Bottled water lined up neatly like emotional support props for corporate discomfort. I arrived 10 minutes early carrying a leather folder that suddenly felt heavier than paper should weigh. Daniel sat beside me, calm as ever, reviewing notes without theatrics. Across the table sat Marcus, Tasha, and their attorney. Marcus looked exhausted. Tasha looked polished enough to sell confidence by the gallon. She wore a cream blazer and a carefully composed expression that might have worked on investors, but landed differently across from the woman whose kitchen history sat documented inside a folder 3 feet away. Nobody reached for the bottled water. That seemed telling. Their attorney opened with practiced warmth. Appreciation. family sensitivity, shared interests, long-term solutions, the verbal equivalent of laying soft blankets over sharp furniture. Then came the offer, recognition payment, limited royalty structure, public acknowledgement language carefully drafted to avoid ownership admission. My contribution, according to the proposal, would be honored as inspirational family culinary influence. Inspirational family culinary influence. I almost admired the creativity. 40 years of work translated into a decorative footnote. Daniel remained perfectly still beside me. Professional stillness. Dangerous stillness. Marcus finally spoke. Mom, we are trying to do the right thing here. The right thing. I looked at my son for a long moment. His wedding photo flashed unexpectedly through my memory. James adjusting Marcus's tie before the ceremony. Pride practically glowing from him. The strange thing about heartbreak is that it rarely arrives all at once. Sometimes it arrives in meetings where your child mistakes negotiation for accountability. Marcus, I said quietly, when exactly did doing the right thing begin after legal threats stopped working? His face tightened. Tasha leaned forward smoothly before he could answer. Eleanor, nobody wanted conflict. No, I asked gently, because cease and desist paperwork feels surprisingly conflict adjacent. Her attorney shifted slightly in his chair. Tiny movement. Tiny crack. Pressure indeed. Daniel opened our documentation folder without hurry. The sound of paper sliding across polished wood suddenly felt louder than it should have. 1994 grocery documentation. Original authorship records. Development notes in James's handwriting. Timeline evidence. Witness statement summary from Naomi regarding Thanksgiving access to the notebook. Nobody interrupted as Daniel walked carefully through the materials. Marcus looked increasingly pale. Tasha remained composed longer, but I noticed something new for the first time since this began. Calculation struggling against uncertainty. Different expression entirely. Their attorney reviewed the documents silently for several moments. No corporate warmth now. Just concentration. Finally, he looked toward his clients. I was not aware this volume of historical documentation existed. There it was. Not aware. A small sentence carrying enormous weight. The room grew very quiet after that. Tasha crossed her arms. Defensive posture replacing polished confidence, one careful inch at a time. We still modernize the product, she said. Commercial adaptation required substantial work. Daniel nodded calmly. That may be relevant in certain discussions. It does not erase origin history. Origin history. I like that phrase. Clean. Accurate. Hard to spin. The meeting stretched another 40 tense minutes through revised proposals, cautious wording, and increasingly obvious attempts to salvage momentum without admitting too much. Then, almost casually, Daniel asked a question that changed everything. By the way, he said pleasantly, how is next week's investor presentation shaping up? The silence that followed was immediate. Sharp. Instinctive. Marcus looked at Tasha. Tasha looked at their attorney. Nobody answered quickly enough. And in that small, accidental pause, I learned exactly what I needed to know. They were not managing strength. They were managing a countdown.